Jazz chords often seem incredibly complicated. Most online lessons will tell you to memorize endless inversions and diatonic chord exercises, but that won't help you when you need to turn a chord symbol into real music. Now, instead of drowning in diagrams and extensions, let me show you a simple way to connect different chord types. And nobody talks about this approach, but players like Joe Pass use it constantly. And the best part is, you already know most of it, you just need to think about it differently. Before we get to the chord system, let me explain some common mistakes that can really hold you back. If you're just memorizing inversions and diagrams, it's easy to get stuck playing static grips instead of creating real music. And that's why I'm going to show you a much more efficient way to approach chords, using a Joe Pass chord solo as an example. Now, this system isn't just great for chord melodies and solos, it's a game changer for comping as well. Think about the first time you learned a jazz chord. Maybe it was something like a C7 with a 13th, and you memorized that as a single grip. Now that's fine for campfire chords, but in jazz, chords aren't static, they're flexible, and you're constantly changing the notes, adding movement and creating melodies with the chords. And this means that you need to know more than just the grip. You need to understand what notes are in the chord and which surrounding notes you can add or change. This one is sometimes a hot take, but while it's helpful to learn voicing systems like drop 2 inversions or diatonic Shell-voicings, it is essential that you learn to mix them when you're playing. Now you'll see exactly how to do that with the Joe Pass example. Let's get to that. Before I moved to the Netherlands, back when I was still living in Copenhagen, I was studying with Morten Kargaard, and he gave me a Joe Pass solo transcription to learn. At the time, this was both a huge challenge and a lot of fun. And I'd already worked on drop 2 and drop 3 voicings, and while learning this solo, I was still trying to figure out how to create my own chord solos. And that's when I noticed something fascinating. In several places, he was clearly using variations of a single chord, transforming it into different types of voicings. In the second chorus, Joe plays this phrase on B flat 7. Now, if you break this down, then I see this is coming out of this voicing, but then the rootless version, which is this, and he's starting with that triad, that's a D diminished triad, then you get sort of a chordal voicing, and then there are 2 drop 2 voicings. But it's all based on that basic B flat 7 chord, and then the rest is just melodic movement that creates the different types of voicings that keep the line dynamic and interesting. Now a little bit later he plays this. And here he begins with a shell-derived voicing, which is this one, sort of a D7 altered, D7 sharp 9 voicing, followed by a drop 2 voicing. But in essence, it's really just one chord and he's just playing different parts of it. I realized that Joe Pass was doing 2 things, mixing voicing types and using variations of basic voicings. Now once I figured that out, things started to get a lot easier. To show you how this works, let's take a simple C major 7 chord and explore how you can apply this concept yourself. One of the easiest and most practical connections to make is between shell voicings and drop 3 voicings. Let me show you how that works. If you take a simple shell voicing like this C major 7 and then add a G on the B string, then you've transformed it into a drop 3 voicing. And this connection is incredibly useful, but just understanding how to move between these 2 voicings, you can already start to create more melodic and dynamic comping lines. Check this out. But the cool part is, it doesn't stop at adding notes. You can also create connections by removing notes. This connection not only changes the structure of the chord, but also helps you move around the neck. Let's start with this drop 3 voicing for C major 7. If you remove the root note C, you're left with this. Now this voicing is of course still obviously a rootless C major 7, but as you might also already know, it is also an E minor triad in the second inversion. Since this works with one inversion of the minor triad, you can of course use the other inversions too. They are the same notes after all. And this gives you these options for playing rootless C major 7 chords. And you can also reinforce the connection by adding the root C in the bass as well, just to hear how these triads really do function as C major 7 chords. Oh, that's weird. Anyway, here's an example of how you might use these in a comping context. this triad connection can be incredibly powerful, especially for chord soloing. Let me quickly show you how this works in a more melodic context. Let's use a B-flat 7 chord and create something that you might play on a B-flat blues. For example, we'll start with a D diminished triad as the upper structure. By adding a G on the B string, you create this, which is sort of a 3-note version of a B-flat 7/13. That would be this one with the root. And of course that leads smoothly up to the other inversion of the D diminished triad, which would be this one, the root position. And we can combine this, and notice how I'm also using the shell voicing and splitting that up to create a bit more movement. Let's get back to the vertical connection, because Joe Pass also linked this to drop 2 voicings, which is incredibly powerful. At its core, this is about fretboard visualization, thinking of one chord but having several ways to play it. And this is where things really start to become powerful, and I will revisit this concept later in the video as well. Let me just break it down. You have the C, that's the foundation of everything. Then you can turn that into a shell voicing. And if you add another note, you get a drop 3. And then if you remove the root, you also have the triad. And what is really great is that if you take the triad and then start adding notes on the high E string, you get a drop 2 voicing. With this system, you could create a major 7 version of the Joe Pass chord solo lick from earlier, so this phrase. For C major 7, that would be something like this. Thinking of these voicings as options for C major 7, whether it's for comping or a chord solo, gives you a ton of practical possibilities. But for this to really work across the fretboard, you also need to be comfortable starting with the other shell voicing, the one with the root on the 5th string. But now that you understand the system, this actually becomes a lot easier. And from there, I'll show you how this can lead to some truly amazing sounds. To explore this concept further, let's look at the other shell voicing. In this case, I'm going to take a G7, because then I'm in the same area of the neck, and we also get to look at another chord. There is one small challenge to figure out, but I'll get to that. Here's the G7. Now, of course, you can add a note on the B string as well, and then you get a G7 with a 9. I usually call these shell-derived voicings, but I don't think there's like a standard name for them. Now, like this, you can also leave out the root, and then you get this one. But in this case, that doesn't directly give you a triad. I could describe this one as a major flat 5 triad, but in the context that's maybe not a great description. Look at what happens when you move this through the scale. As you can see, none of these really work as traditional triads, but we don't really need to care what the name is. The voicing still functions beautifully as a rootless G7 with a 9, and you can of course also add a note on the E string to turn it into a drop 2 voicing. And like this, you would create a similar set of voicings for the G7, giving us essentially the same melody for that Joe Pass lick. Now that you have this version as well, let's explore what you can do with a short progression. One of the most powerful lessons from Joe Pass is that everything you play stems from simple, basic versions of the chords, which is essentially also what you've seen in this video. You think the simple chord, and whatever you add is just a variation of that chord. For example, in a basic 2-5-1, the chords that you think might look like this, and you'll probably recognize the C major 7 and the G7. But you don't need to stick with playing them as full shapes. You can separate the bass note and play rootless variations, giving you a lot more possibilities with both melody and rhythm, the stuff that I've in fact already covered. And that will give you something like this. This way of thinking doesn't just apply to chord solos, it works beautifully in comping too, especially in a band setting where you can leave the bass to the bass player. Here's an example of how you could use this approach while comping in a band. Thinking about chords like this is a game changer for developing your chord melody skills as well, and you'll see just how well it works when I break down the Autumn Leaves arrangement in this video. It just all fits together, and chord melody is really one of the most fun aspects of jazz guitar, where you get to blend groove, melody and harmony to create your own version of a song. Check it out. Learn jazz, make music.